Ghost of Tsushima is one of the best looking games that was released on PlayStation 4. Released last year, it's a beautiful open world game with a gorgeous grass system, beautiful lighting, and well, it was very well received. But of course, given that it came out in 2020, it should come as no surprise that the game was updated for PlayStation 5. But what's interesting this time is that it actually received two specific updates for the PlayStation 5. First of which is the frame rate boost, which applies to the original game. That brings it up to 60 frames per second. And the man who looked at that on our channel is Richard Ledbetter, which is why he's here today.
Hello there, John. Yeah, I'm really interested to see what you've come up with the PlayStation 5 version of Ghost of Tsushima, because from my perspective, the PS4 version with Back Compat Plus, 60 frames per second, absolutely gorgeous, transformative in all of the right ways, but it was still a PlayStation 4 app, right? And this is actually now a native PlayStation 5 code. So I'm really interested to see what the actual improvements are.
Well, as we'll find out, there's not that many improvements to this one, but there are some, and some of the changes are pretty interesting. But perhaps the first one we should talk about, and it's somewhat pedestrian, I suppose, but it's the save transfer process. Now, obviously, this is a well-known issue with PS4 to PS5 games that we've seen many times before. The act of actually bringing a save from a PS4 game into a new version, it usually requires downloading the original PS4 version as well as the PS5 version, running the original game, uploading your save to the cloud, then starting the new game and downloading it from there. And it is kind of a hassle, especially in, I think, Final Fantasy VII, the PS5 version, that was especially arduous, to say the least.
Right.
But Ghost of Tsushima actually really improves upon that, doesn't it?
Yeah, so here's the thing. Up until recently, PlayStation 5 apps had no access to PS4 game data stored locally on the system or in the cloud. But I did see in the SDK roadmap that this was going to be addressed, and it has been. So Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order also did this, but it is also deployed in Tsushima here. So I did take a quick look at this before we started to record, and fundamentally you have your menu option here, which allows you to transfer across your PS4 saves, right? To make sure this wasn't any kind of cloud application, I literally turned off the network function on my PS5. But it was still able to dip into the PS4 directory on my PS5 where all of my saves were, and it was able to import those saves and transfer them across to PlayStation 5. So this is real progress here. In theory, other games can tap into this functionality too. It means that if you have existing PS4 saves, they can transfer across seamlessly to PS5 without any bizarre cloud transfer system. So yeah, this is genuine progress here.
Yeah, it is. It's great that they actually improved that, because it was a bit of a hassle before. Especially for us when we're testing multiple versions of a game. But yep, that is addressed. Now, once you actually boot up the game, obviously the first thing that you will notice is a boost to image quality. Namely, it now defaults to a higher resolution, and looking at the counts, it's 2160p or 4K. But especially when you look at it in stills, you will notice that there are still a checkerboard-like artifacts present in the image. It's especially noticeable in things like grass and blowing cloth, but you can kind of see it along many different edges in these still shots. So it basically seems to be using reconstruction or a form of checkerboard rendering, which is not a bad thing. That's just something to note there.
Right.
But it is noticeably crisper than the PS4 version, PS4 Pro specifically. Now, there is always the potential for dynamic resolution scaling in games like this, but the original release didn't seem to use it, and I didn't detect any examples of it here, so it does seem to be a steady 4K pixel count with checkerboard rendering. But if you miss the lower resolution 1800p of the PS4 Pro version, that's still available because you can enable a higher frame rate mode, which is that instead. But when we get to the performance section, you'll see why that's kind of a weird, pointless addition as far as I'm concerned. Right. So I'm not really sure why it's there.
Well, this is interesting, right? Because when I tested Tsushima running under Back Compat Plus, it was basically a logged 60 frames per second, right? And I think it was only in photo mode that I could make any kind of performance dip happen in a sort of entirely artificial manner. But there was always the sense that it was so locked to 60 frames per second that there was a lot of overhead remaining. And it looks like this is kind of what's happening, what's kind of being borne out here, because we are seemingly moving from 1800p checkerboard to 2160p checkerboard with the same performance level. And wow, that's pretty impressive. Good stuff.
Yeah, it's a nice improvement for sure. But another thing that is actually rather cool and kind of unexpected is that they have... So, okay, in the original game, there's a lot of these cinematic cutscenes, and it turns out that many of them are actually video clips. They're pre-rendered out. And from what we can tell, looking at what the developers have discussed over the year, this was done primarily to hide loading times, because there's several times where a scene will jump from one area of the island to a completely different area of the island, while loading the next gameplay sequence. And obviously there's no way to do that seamlessly on a PS4. There would be large pauses between those scenes. So they pre-rendered a lot of those sequences. On PS5, all of the cutscenes are now entirely rendered in real time, which is interesting. Now, this is the one thing where the frame rate is still capped at 30 frames per second during the cutscenes, which I suspect was just an artistic choice to sort of retain the original look. But it is interesting if you compare the two, is that, you know, you will see a few extra visual artifacts on PS5 now that they're rendered in real time, stuff that you didn't see in the pre-renders. But there are still the cutscenes which were real time to begin with, like this one, and it's actually here where you might notice some actual differences in terms of the presentation, specifically on some of the finer textures, like the sword here. Look at the logo or the emblem here. The resolution is boosted. But this also highlights something else. So in your original video on the PS5, running the PS4 version in backwards compatibility plus, you noted that the real-time cutscenes could actually run at 60. While, of course, the pre-rendered stuff was still 30, right? Well, here on PS5 in its native mode, all cutscenes are now capped at 30. My thinking here, again, ties into what I said before, in that I think it's a stylistic choice and they wanted to keep some consistency. But it does kind of make you wonder. Still, overall, I do think the cutscenes look better, I would say. But there's a secondary benefit in that it means that if you play with the Japanese language option, there's now proper lip sync.
Right.
Basically, the fact that it's real time means that they can have a second set of, facial data, or allow it to real time conform to the different language. And, you know, obviously the reason that wasn't possible before is file size. The videos on PS4 Pro were stored in a very high quality format, and I think they couldn't afford to store them twice, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great.
So, obviously, along those same lines, then, there's the loading. This is the reason they're able to do the cutscenes in real time, I believe. And just like other similar PS5 titles, there basically is no more loading. There's no loading screens. So you just hit continue from the main menu, or you fast travel from any spot on the map, and it just fades to black and then fades into the new area. So,
okay,
that's pretty good, too.
That is good. But beyond resolution and loading times, it's kind of thin pickings, right? In terms of improvements.
Yeah. So unfortunately, that's kind of where the big improvements end. And this is actually a little bit surprising to me because, fundamentally, all of the rendering features are the same. So things like LOD distance, for instance. If you look here in the distance, you'll see objects sort of pop in and grass sort of pop in at exactly the same point on both of them. Shadow quality remains the same. It's still the same resolution. You still, have the distance cut off that you saw in the original PS4 version. Effects, water. I mean, really the only difference that I noticed, I guess, is the texture stuff, where in very select instances, I noticed slightly higher resolution textures, like the sword that I mentioned before. But even that is rather rare.
Right. Okay. Well, this does present an interesting conundrum, right? Because we're looking at higher resolution, faster loading, and real-time cutscenes. But that isn't a huge amount of extras compared to, say, Spider-Man Remastered. And at the same time, Sony is asking for quite a lot of extra money to upgrade from the PlayStation 4 to the PlayStation 5 version of the game.
Right, so looking at their page, it's kind of complicated, I guess, where essentially, if you already own the original game on PS4, you can upgrade to the Director's Cut on PS4 for $20. But from there, if you want to upgrade that version to PS5, it's an extra $10. Whereas if you just want to upgrade directly from the original PS4 version to the PS5 version with the Director's Cut content, that's $30. But from what I can tell, it doesn't actually seem like there is a regular version of Ghost of Tsushima available for PS5. So to play on PS5, it has to be the Director's Cut version. I don't know, it's a little bit convoluted and a little disappointing because we have seen some really stellar examples of free updates with new visual updates and modes and all that. And you don't really get that here per se. And I guess the way they're probably thinking of it is that if you already own it on PS4, you get the automatic backwards compatible plus version, which updates things to 60 frames per second, which by itself is a pretty nice upgrade. And honestly, the native PS5 version isn't significantly different, as we've discussed.
Right. Well, that's the thing, right? Because obviously the Spider-Man upgrade had ray tracing, had 60 frames per second. But then again, when you think about it, Tsushima did get a 60 FPS upgrade for free.
That's what I mean, yeah.
So, yeah, it's kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really, isn't it, in terms of value?
Yeah, the one thing I will say, and this doesn't really address the issue, is I am at least happy to see that it's getting a physical retail disc for the PS5, which basically means you get a complete version of the game with all the changes, fixes, extra content, etc. So it's kind of like that is now preserved on a disc. So, small comforts, but there it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's move on because they've actually made some significant changes elsewhere. Obviously, we've got the new content, we've got the new island, but they haven't stopped there, right? There are changes within the core game.
Yeah, and this is something that I do think the PS4 will get just by default. This is coming in the newest patch, as far as I can tell. Essentially, they've added two things that addressed complaints that I had with the original game. One is lock-on, and one is different controller settings. So in the original game, essentially you use the face buttons, square and triangle, to attack, and the right stick is, of course, your camera. You couldn't actually lock on to an enemy, so the camera was a lot more sort of free-form. It would try to track the action, but I always found it didn't do the best job at that. And that, to me, made playing the combat a lot less enjoyable than it could have been, because I never felt like you could truly keep an eye on it in the way that you would like to, like we see in other games. And the fact that you have the face buttons only for attack meant that you couldn't keep one thumb on the right stick and the others on the attack button. So now you can actually use R1 and R2 as attack and strong attack, much like a Souls game, which I have come to prefer.
Okay.
And that means you can leave your thumb on the right stick or circle for dodging, kind of go back and forth. But on top of that, you can now do lock-on. And they actually have two iterations of it. You can just do lock-on where you lock onto whatever enemy you want. You swap between them with the right stick. And then when you kill that enemy, the lock-on goes away. Or you can have it automatically switch to the next nearest enemy. And for me, these two changes are kind of a game changer in the sense that it's just a lot more fun to play. So I'm very, very happy that they made this update to the core gameplay. It does make the combat just much more fun.
Wow. That's great news, isn't it? Because that was basically the key criticism you had with the game at launch.
Yeah, that was the thing that really sort of detracted from it for me. I just never really enjoyed the combat as much as I felt like I could. So that's good. And on top of that, we're not going to get too much into any spoiler territory here, but of course there's the new Iki Island add-on, which is pretty cool. Again, that's something that unlocks when you get to Act 2 and beyond, and you can just select it from the menu and hop on over to the new island, and it's basically more Tsushima. It's like a standalone little story on its own little island. It's similar to what we've seen in other games that gets this kind of add-on content. So I think that's kind of one of the bigger draws to this new version as well, is you just get that extra content. So that's good.
Good stuff. So where do we go from here? I guess we should be talking about performance, but certainly from my testing on the PS4 Backcompat Plus version, there wasn't really much to say. It was locked 60. How are we looking now with a native PS5 app?
I can only describe the performance as uneventful.
In a good way.
Yeah, exactly. So I played a good 5 or 6 hours straight in the high-res mode, by the way. And I wasn't able to actually reproduce any sort of dips or drops in performance. And that includes while using photo mode, by the way.
Oh, really?
So everything is just completely stable. I liked to use photo mode to get some cinematic shots just for certain bits of the video as well. It's something I always do in games with photo mode. And yeah, it used to cause some slight slowdown, but that is no longer the case. So it's just a very smooth frame rate, locked 60 across the board. Of course, I say this with the caveat that this is a big open world game and there's no way to test every element of it. So the possibility exists that you could find a moment of slowdown somewhere if you search hard enough. But I would say by and large, it's not something that you're going to have to worry about. It's just completely stable, which is why I said that the frame rate mode, the lower resolution mode, doesn't make a lot of sense to me because it looks worse and runs the same. It basically looks like the game did running in backwards compatibility plus mode.
Right. Okay. Well, in theory, let's just say that there is a part of the map somewhere that does not hit 60 frames per second. Then you can swap to the frame rate mode and that will sort it, presumably. But yeah, the concept of actually retaining that when you can play 5 hours without a single frame drop is interesting.
I would have loved if they had included, say, a 120 hertz mode. That would have been excellent. Drop the res and bump up the frame rate further, but alas, that does not seem to be the case.
Okay, fair enough.
Cutscenes, of course, I noted, are 30 frames per second like the original. They are real time now, and the frame pacing is perfect, as far as I can see here, which was not always the case with the pre-renders, it should be noted. So, it basically looks and runs better than the PS4 version, but it looks very similar.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on and talk about the DualSense controller here, because when I did that PS4 transfer test, just booting the game, when you get that initial intro, they actually introduce some haptics to that. And that's just like an incidental thing that just happens. But it do seem to have put some thought into this, right?
Yeah, I do appreciate when haptics are used well. And they are used well here. It definitely adds something to the game, but it's not the... So there's been two types of haptic usage I've seen with the DualSense. Those that use it very well. Obviously, Astro's Playroom was one of the best for that. But several other first-party games, Returnal was great for this. But then you have other games where they go too far. I love Dirt 5, for instance, but by default, the what they do with the triggers, it's way too intense, and it actually makes just holding the trigger down annoying over long periods. Here, this is kind of part of the former, where all of the integrations, it's all relatively subtle, but it's nice. You'll kind of feel sort of certain ambient effects around you. You'll feel the sensation of pulling the bow back, of using the sword, and all those types of things that you would expect, as well as, sound coming through it. Nothing revolutionary here, but I do think it is very well implemented, and it's probably one of the better that I've used thus far.
Okay.
So depending on your feelings on those, if you liked how it felt in games like Returnal, you should be happy with this one.
Good stuff. Okay, well, let's just wrap everything up then, because it's interesting, because Tsushima as a game has always been awesome. It's now even more awesome because the control criticisms we had have been comprehensively addressed. But there's two things to sort of address here. First of all, there's the those quality of life improvements. The game is definitely better. But at the same time, there is the fact that PlayStation 5 upgrades aren't as dramatic as other ones, and you already got the most dramatic one, the upgrade to 60 frames per second for free, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's kind of interesting that you do still get that. So if you don't want to upgrade, I would say just playing the PS4 version on PS5 is still excellent. But these improvements are nice. And it's more like, I would say it's interesting if you're interested in the extra content, basically. You get those technical improvements, but there's actually more, there's a new story to it. that you can enjoy. So that's kind of the big reason I would say that you want to check it out if you're really into the game. But if you're just looking at the technical upgrades, that's going to vary from person to person, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think if you bought PlayStation 5 and you didn't own PlayStation 4, I mean, just the Back Compat Plus upgrade was enough for me to want to play it. But, you know, basically you're getting even more enhancements now, and you've got the prospect of being able to own this as a physical purchase, the kind of complete edition, which is all good.
Yeah, precisely. So that's kind of the main thing. Yeah, it's if you haven't played it and you're looking for this kind of open world experience, this one will deliver for you, and it's nice to have it complete on disc. So that's pretty much it, though. It's a nice upgrade, but nothing revolutionary or especially, it doesn't go above and beyond what you would expect.
Okay, fair enough.
But I think that's going to do it for this one, so thanks for joining me, Rich.
Absolutely.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell, and of course, follow us over on Twitter, and check out the original video over on the DF supporter program, where you get the nice, higher resolution, high bitrate version for download. But that's going to do it for us. Thanks for watching.